Thank you very much, Stormy. I hope my mic is on. Yes, I think it is. Stormy, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, also for having me here. We are still sort of navigating here, and I would appreciate, Stormy, if you could, because I need my glasses from my backpack. Otherwise, the next one. Yeah. Otherwise, I'll be flying completely blind here. So, I was very, very happy when Stormy invited me to steer this this Oxford-style debate. Why? I've written a book about the role of debates in democracies 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm a big fan of debates. I'm a very big fan of heated debates. Why? Because they play a very, very prominent role in democracies. What do debates do? They inform, they integrate, and we know from debates or from groups who had a position which at the very end perhaps was not considered as a solution for a problem, that they through the debate, felt integrated and had a higher likelihood of supporting the solution, which they actually were not in favor of. So that's the second point. It's integrating, it's informing, but, and that's the third point, and that will most likely play a very prominent role here, it makes our arguments better. At the very end, in a debate, if I debate with my students, if I debate with my kids, at the end of some debates, say, you know what? Your argument convinced me. I'm changing my opinion on this. And that's what debates also do, right? And that's why when Stormy invited me to moderate here, and when I saw the line out of this and I need my notes here because it's quite a complex navigation here, I thought fantastic, because what we will do now, first of all, I will in 2 minutes welcome our distinguished 2 teams. I will present the two points we will discuss upon. And then before we start the discussion, the audience will vote on those 2 respective items, right? And then after our discussion, after going back and forth with the respected teams, but also with you, we will have the vote again. And we will see what the debate actually made with your opinion on subject A or subject B. So I have notes here which are not mine. Someone took mine. So before we start talking about the issues we will debate, let me introduce team number 1 and ask team number 1 here on the podium. Dr. Daniel Eriksson, Professor Lisandra Flach, and Jain. Team number 1, welcome on stage. Perhaps if you would go to my left side. Team number 2, Dr. Bown, Dr. Claudia Schmucker, and Melanie Vogelbach. Welcome, team number 2. And if I could ask you to come here. Let me very briefly introduce the distinguished team to you. Daniel Eriksson is CEO of Transparency International. Lisandra Flach is director of the IFO Center for International Economics and professor of economics at the LMU in Munich. And Jain is director for Democratic Order, Scowcroft Strategy Initiative at the Atlantic Council. A warm welcome from our end and also from the audience. Now, our distinguished team number 2. Bown, Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at Peterson Institute for International Economics. Claudia Schmucker, Head Geo-Economics Program, German Council on Foreign Relations. And Melanie Vogelbach, Head of International Economic Policy and Foreign Trade Law at the Association of German Chambers of Industry. Also a warm round of applause for team number 2. Now, there are, I've mentioned that before, 2 questions that are being debated this evening. And I will read out the questions to you. And I have the most important person for making this run smoothly is standing right here. With the bell, and with the bell we will keep the time, and you will also explain to the audience how the voting will function, okay? But before we do that, let me share the 2 arguments that will be debated on stage from our 2 teams. I have to say, and it was very important to the team members that I share this with you, the positions, or the respective positions we will debate were assigned to the teams. So the first one, we will discuss friendshoring is the solution to the changing geopolitical environment versus diversification and continued multilateralism are the better way to deal with the changing geopolitical environment. Those are the 2 questions at stake, and I would like to hand over to you so that you can very briefly say how the voting will work.
Yeah, I think most of you were already here in the morning. Just use the QR code. It should work for all the way to the back. If that doesn't work, you can use the website, slido.com, and just put in the number.
And number 2.
Ah.
It's interesting.
Yeah. It's good. Oh, yeah. No. We can take a challenge. Oh. Those pro-diversification are slow voters.
Slow voters, yes.
Yeah.
Well, voting in this city is an issue, you know that.
I know. Yeah.
So it seems that we have a majority for the statement diversification and continued multilateralism are the better way to deal with the changing geopolitical environment. I think this won't change much anymore, and I also think that all of you, most of you have already cast their vote. Let's keep that in mind and return to our voting again, or to this result at the end of our debate, and see what the discussion actually, what effect the discussion actually had on our views. So, let me start now with the debate and the presentations of the proposition and oppositions. So each team now has 9 minutes, each participant 3 minutes to present their arguments, and then we will engage in quite a complex back and forth, and that's why I have my notes in front of me. So, team 1. And I'm looking at you with the bell and with the timing. The 3 minutes will start now. 3, 2, 1. The floor is yours.
Terrific. Thank you. Great to be here with you. So our team's position is that friendshoring, or ally shoring, as some call it, is the right solution for today's changing geopolitical environment. I'd like to kick off for our team by making the strategic case for friendshoring, and I'll make 5 points. First, the US, Europe, and other democracies around the world have become increasingly dependent on revisionist autocracies, namely China and Russia, across a range of sectors, from oil and gas, energy, to pharmaceutical ingredients, to lithium-ion batteries. Second, the concern over supply chain dependencies is not just theoretical. Moscow and Beijing are using their economic clout to coerce democracies to accede to their demands. We've seen after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the way Moscow sought to cut energy exports to the EU in order to compel payment in rubles. China recently restricted Australian imports after its leaders called for an investigation into the COVID-19 origins. And Beijing retaliated against Lithuania for its decision to allow Taiwan to open an office in its country. Countless other examples. Some politicians have suggested the best way to deal with these challenges is to shift towards domestic onshoring. The risk is that this could lead to protectionism, with the US Congress recently passing legislation to buy American and engage in provisions for subsidies. We're seeing this happen. But a more attractive solution, we contend, is friendshoring or ally shoring. That is, sourcing essential goods and services with countries that share democratic values and a commitment to an open, rules-based order. Now, friendshoring does not mean complete decoupling. Rather, we need a differentiated approach. So let's consider 3 categories of trade. The first is military goods, highly advanced technology, in which trade would be off limits with Russia and China. The second category would consist of critical, sensitive sectors, such as some technologies, rare earth minerals, aviation equipment, where trade could be limited and encouraged to shift to trusted allies and partners. And then the third category would be general goods and services, toys, furniture, where trade would proceed according to market forces. So the key question here is which nations should be included as friends or allies and would benefit from these supply chain shifts? Well, I would contend that nations that meet certain criteria, democracy, respect for the rule of law, human rights, support for the rules-based order, they should be the primary beneficiaries of this kind of supply chain restructuring. Other friendly regimes, authoritarian regimes, such as Vietnam or the UAE, could participate perhaps. So the bottom line is, let me conclude, friendshoring would allow leading democracies to establish more resilient supply chains. It would counter current trends toward protectionism.
3 minutes, unfortunately, I was told, is 3 minutes. So thanks a lot for your contribution.
Thank you very much.
Daniel, the next 3 minutes are yours.
Thank you, thank you.
Nee.
Happy Valentine's Day, everyone.
Okay.
Isn't that great? We're free to love whoever we want in the city with one of the longest standing pride parades of Europe. How much is that worth? Is a reduction of GDP growth over 10 years by 5% an okay amount? Is it worth that? How much value are we willing to put on our human rights? Trading with kleptocrats strengthens the kleptocrats. They will use the income from that trade to solidify their positions in those states, to hamper down on human rights in their home countries, to block out any potential of democracy gaining foothold there. Not only that, they will grow this wealth, and we have seen evidence over the last 10 plus years of that power being then used and directed towards us in the liberal democracies and our freedoms through our election systems, through our rule of law systems. Any weakness that they can find, they exploit it in order to erode our democracies and make our elected leadership look foolish. Is trade, unfettered trade with those kleptocracies that only have to gain in building their power, something that we should be open to these days? I can understand, speaking to a room full of trade economists coming from a completely different perspective of human rights, that sounding protectionist is an alarmist approach. I'm not protectionist. What Ash described is we would divide the kind of goods and we would divide the world in 3 tranches with allies, liberal democracies. We would have a third category with those who clearly are kleptocrats, and then it would be a category in the middle that would be assessed. We need to do this. We need friendshoring, intelligent friendshoring, in order to protect our values that our countries are built upon. We need to have friendshoring in order to ensure that the kleptocrats don't get their hands on technologies and tools and resources in terms of funds that will enable them to further clamp down on their own populace. There's no other way of approaching this than to tear up our old ways of thinking about free markets as being the only way forward to sustainable development and look at a different approach that we need to defend democracy first and then ensure continuous development of our economies second. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel, also for staying within the 3 minutes. Last but not least, on team number 1, Lisandra.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here. And some of you might be wondering why I'm sitting on this side of the table. On several studies, we have shown the importance of diversification, the importance of multilateralism, and we have also quantified the costs of decoupling from global supply chains and the costs of friendshoring. But here in my role today, I'm here to, bring some aspects or some arguments in favor of friendshoring. And I'm thinking in terms of friendshoring in a more nuanced way, as Ash mentioned, so not in terms of decoupling, but rather in terms of reducing dependencies from autocratic states. Right? And so in one of the studies that we have investigated German trade relations, we have identified several products that have critical dependencies with the Chinese economy. And so as has been discussed already here today, China has already shown in several instances that it's willing to use its political power to achieve economic objectives. Right? And so I think it's key to really reduce these dependencies from, and this is the case of other autocratic states, but it's in particular more severe when it comes to powerful countries. And so it's key to reduce these dependencies, in particular when it comes to critical goods from autocratic states. And this comes by, increasing or enhancing trade relations with democracies, with countries that share the same values. And so increasing trade relations, increasing trade agreements also with countries that share similar values with Europe here in the case. And so the current, certainly the best way would be through multilateralism, so as our colleagues would argue later. So this would be the most effective and comprehensive way to ensure a rules-based trade system. But the current geopolitical challenges require an active trade policy with further world regions, and in particular with democracies, to increase the number of friends. Right? And so to increase, and this is also a way of friendshoring. So really creating trade relations with additional trade partners. So if you think of Latin American countries, Africa, so several trade agreements that would actually help increase the resilience of supply chains. I will stop here since
I can't see the time. Thank you very much, Lisandra. We now. Big round of applause to team number 1. And as I said earlier, the positions were assigned. We now move to team number 2, where we discuss multilateralism. And Claudia, you will start the argumentation for team number 2.
Yes, thank you very much. So we are the team that still believes in multilateralism. It is very true. We have a different geo-economic environment and we need to react to the new risks that we have. But instead of decoupling and instead of friendshoring, which is very costly and very difficult to implement, I think my colleagues will refer to this, the motto should be de-risking. So what does this entail? And I have 4 points in this regard. The first one is we need a deepening of global markets. The role of global trade as a shock absorber far outweighs the role of trade as a shock supplier, which means global value chains have succeeded in times of crisis, during the financial crisis and also comparatively well during the corona crisis. For this to work, we need a renewed global multilateral cooperation. We need new ways to manage global trade frictions. We need new rules and commitments. This was mentioned by Angela this morning on services, on digital trade, and the fight on climate change. And we need a dialogue of what is fair and what is not fair. That said, there is still a nexus between national security and trade where we do need some decoupling. And this refers to dual-use technology, IT infrastructure, and critical dependencies. The EU did a study on critical import, and 6% of European imports are considered to be critical. This means we need a tailored trade strategy for these 6% and not an overall of our whole global trade relations. The right way forward is diversification, and this is the most useful way to de-risk. And for this, we need to negotiate and implement free trade agreements. This leads to new market access, to economic opportunities, also to new access to rare earth and raw materials, and this also helps building allies and partnerships. So to sum up, decoupling and friendshoring are costly, impossible to implement. De-risking is the motto. We need a slight decoupling, but more deepening of global markets and diversification.
Thank you. And so very well within time. So thank you very much. Melanie, you are the second presenter of your group.
Yes, thank you very much. So throughout the day, and also from our opposing team, we heard many times that we do need to reduce our dependencies. We agree. It's important, as State Minister Lindner said earlier, to reduce one-sided critical dependencies. And we see that many companies here in Germany are already trying to do that. We see it in the chamber network abroad. Many companies are trying to diversify their supply chain, but it is complicated. It is very, very difficult. And we see many companies are trying to find alternative sources, for example, from China, with a China +1, +2, +3 strategy, sourced from other countries in the region. So that is complicated enough, that is costly enough. Why would we artificially reduce the number of potential alternatives by categorizing the alternatives in friends and non-friends, making it even more difficult to achieve? Friendshoring is basically a nicer way of describing decoupling. Everybody always says we don't want decoupling, but we want friendshoring. But it is pretty much just a different name for the same thing. And friendshoring and complete decoupling, in my opinion, is not realistic. When we look at it, and we heard it also mentioned throughout the day before, many important raw materials we do source from countries that are not part of the G7 or the OECD. A smartphone today is not a single smartphone today is sourced only from Western countries. An iPhone, for example, has the supply chain that includes more than 40 countries in 5 continents. So really, just friendshoring decoupling is really not realistic in our interconnected world. Lisandra mentioned the EFO study, which I also know quite well. It shows that if we not just try to reduce our trade with China, but from all autocratic states together, actually the negative impact on our GDP would be twice as harsh. So that is not something that we should look forward to. So rather de-risking than decoupling would be the way to go. Last but not least, it remains the question, who really qualifies as a friend? If we only focus on Western democracies alone, we exclude many countries of the so-called global South. Do we really want that? That would have incredibly negative impact on their development, and that's not something that we could want. I would like to end with quoting the WTO Director General, who recently said in Davos, when people talk about friendshoring, I get a little bit nervous because I don't know who is a friend. When you say that, I never hear any countries in Africa mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I must say we have a very disciplined panel because I hardly hear the bell ringing, so that's fantastic. Chad, you will conclude the arguments of group number 2 in your 3 minutes. The floor is yours.
So first, like my colleagues, I want to acknowledge that I think we all recognize the challenges and that we need to do something different, and we're not naive. And so we appreciate especially Ash having laid out those key challenges that new policy needs to address. But one of the things that the first side left off when listing all of the current challenges are that there are global challenges that we have to deal with collectively with autocracies. And that means climate change and global public health. We cannot live in a world in which our friends are the only ones dealing with climate problems or public health problems. We live in one world, we have to share it, we have to deal with these things collectively, and part of that is through international trade. The other thing is trying to imagine how you would implement friendshoring. Friendshoring is an amazing slogan, but when you think about trying to implement it, let's just walk through what it would mean and how impossible it would ultimately become. All of the third countries out there that aren't obviously, you're trying to attract to your side of the friend fence, all of them would ultimately have to implement the same kinds of policies that you and your friends implement, or else there's going to be economic leakage, as we've seen with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That means they're going to need to do the same, kind of rules on tariffs, on subsidies, on those types of things. Sanctions, finance, right? A lot of these commodities out there in the world, they just flow around to wherever economic incentives allow them to go. Unless everybody in that third part of the world comes to your side, you're going to get this leakage in which your attempts to deal with the problems that you're concerned with that caused you to friendshore in the first place aren't going to be met, let alone the technological problems. So I would say we recognize all the concerns. We also recognize that what we're talking about as a multilateral approach would need to be different from the WTO's current system. We acknowledge that there are existing challenges and incompleteness with the WTO rules, but that there has to be some minimal amount of economic engagement, even with autocracies, to incentivize them to do some things that are for the global public good, on climate, on public good at a minimum, let alone whether we want to get into issues of democracy and human rights. We need to retain some solid interdependence there that we can exercise. And so while we are interested in pursuing diversification and those kinds of objectives, the real key is how ultimately you choose to get there. And it's not that the current WTO's rules are perfect, but using that sort of approach, carving out new rules within that approach is the best way to go.
Thanks a lot, Tom. So we've listened to two very different lines of argument, and now the interaction starts. First here on the podium, and then with you in the audience. So one speaker of your group now has the chance to pose one question to team number two. Team number two then has 4 minutes to answer, and then it's going to be the other way around. Have you already consulted about the question you want to ask to team number two?
Sure.
Yeah.
Is this working?
Okay, Ashley.
Okay. All right. So I think we heard a pretty significant concession, which is there is a portion of the economy that requires reducing dependencies and potentially friendshoring. So my question to you, or at least diversifying. Now, the question I have for you is with regard to those sectors in which we have these critical dependencies, whether it's 6% or 15% or 20%, where should those how can those changes be incentivized? Is there a role for having some kind of system in place or framework where diversification would shift those supply chains towards certain countries? And if so, shouldn't there be some criteria for where those supply chains go? That's what friendshoring is all about. Having some set of criteria where friends and allies, trusted partners, those that believe in the rule of law, benefit from having those shifts in supply chains rather than just letting them go randomly. And we may have new problems with new autocracies and new dependencies if we fail to do this systematically.
All right. I turn over to you.
Thank you so much for the question. Incentivize diversification is a good point. We can do that by agreeing on multilateral rules that make it fair and have a level playing field for everyone, but also with FTAs. So if we have free trade agreements with partners that we can agree with on certain rules, on sustainability issues, and many other things, then of course we can incentivize companies to trade with those partners more. Our opinion is, of course, that we should have that with as many countries as possible to have more options in a diversification and to be able to reduce risks and source from many places.
Yes, I can only agree. And I think it's important what I said, what the EU did. It's 6% where we have critical dependencies. And I think that number is relevant because it means we should not change our entire trade policy towards friendshoring, but we have a small number of critical dependencies on countries where we are vulnerable, where we need to diversify. And as Melanie said, we have a lot of free trade agreements in place. The EU is negotiating further and very ambitious free trade agreements. And I think this is just the way to diversify. And this also relates to rare earth. We have EU-Chile, EU-Argentina, EU-Australia. That's also a way to diversify, especially with the dependencies that we have.
My response would be to say this isn't purely an autocracy problem. So if we look at one of the critical dependencies out there that we have in the world today, it's on high-end semiconductors. Where are they all made? In Taiwan and South Korea. I'm from the United States. Taiwan and South Korea are our friends. We love them. They're not autocracies, right? But we have a real geographic concentration problem with that I don't think even free trade agreements are going to help deal with. We're going to have to create some new incentives like subsidies, and that means changing probably some of the international rules to be able to accomplish, even if we didn't have problems with autocracies, we would still have excessive geographic of concentration problems, that we can't live in this new world where we've got climate shocks and public health shocks and things like that we do have to deal with. But I think friendshoring alone, defining it that way, is going to be insufficient to solve those problems.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe if you allow, since we have a few more minutes left, also if we concentrate on just one or two additional sources, we have to be sure that those are reliable friends in eternity. And we know from recent experience that even with transatlantic partners, with friends, we did have trade conflicts and difficulties. So the question is, who really is a reliable friend? So if we concentrate only on those, it's also a risk. So diversification is key.
So when
yes. Anything else your group wants to add?
So when do we ask them separately a question later? Or?
Yeah, right. Now it's the other way around. Now we come to your team asking one question to team number one.
Perfect.
Okay.
And we start, right, time is running.
I have a two-part question. How does friendshoring address Africa and the climate crisis? Go.
Yeah, to begin with the climate crisis, I can start with that and Ash take the rest. A kleptocracy is not going to respect fact. They don't respect fact. Look at how these kleptocracies dealt with the pandemic. Look at how they in general see the climate crisis. There's only one way of getting them to join our fight in those areas, and that is to pay them off. And that is very short-termistic, because they don't see the problem. Their ultimate goal is to stay in power and to use that power for their personal gain. The bigger global issues is not in their interest as much as we see that it should be in their people's interest. It's not in the ruling elite's interest because they have the money to work around those issues. Ash.
So with regard to Africa or any region of the world, it all depends on the criteria. There are countries in Africa, in Latin America, around the world that would meet criteria for friendshoring if they're democracies, if they respect the rule of law, if they respect human rights. Furthermore, that's an incentive for nations, for governments to make those steps in the direction of respecting democracy and human rights. If they do, they benefit tremendously from these economic shifts that they otherwise wouldn't get access to. This is a powerful incentive in the direction of anti-corruption and democracy. And why not take advantage of that to push for a world in which people live better as a result of sound economic policies. With regard to climate, well, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Why can't we continue to negotiate a climate agreement as we are currently in different settings, in different formats, even while we come up with a framework for friendshoring that protects our own values? We do this all the time in international relations. These aren't linked necessarily, and there are ways to continue conversations with the Chinese, Russians, and others when it comes to other global issues without sacrificing our values.
Yeah, since we still have a bit of time, yeah. So yeah, I also believe that it's possible to have layers where you cooperate and layers where you are rival, right? And so cooperating in terms of environment doesn't mean that. So I'm not thinking in terms of decoupling. So decoupling would make indeed fighting against climate change way harder, but decreasing these dependencies from autocratic states and increasing cooperation among democracies would not hamper, fighting against climate change, which is a global challenge.
Well, can I offer one more point on the climate? There have been good reports on ways in which friendshoring can help alleviate the climate crisis. How? If we can network with our friends and allies around sensible, high-technology solutions that get at climate change, we're putting on the table some new solutions that could help mitigate those impacts rather than relying simply on waiting for the Chinese to come on board, which may or may not happen anytime soon.
Yeah.
You still have 1 minute left?
I could mention, yes, I think it was Michael Berthold that said this morning the concept of made in a democracy. If we have goods and maybe services that we can target, label as made in a democracy, that we know if we buy them, we pay more, but we also know that that result in no injustices on other people. That could be something that could augment a concept of friendshoring. Because in the end, what we're doing right now is putting the world at risk by engaging in trade with kleptocracies.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to both teams. I did say it's time for the interaction. We had the interaction here on stage, and now we would like to invite the audience. The rules of the game, quote unquote, are that we have one question from the audience posed to team 1 and one question posed to team 2, and each team has 5 minutes to answer the question. So I would start with the posing of a question to team number 1. I see a hand here right next to the micro. Yes? Could you stand up and use the micro, please? And it's a question to team number 1.
This is team number 1?
Yes, and could you stand up, please? Thank you.
So my question is, what about the principles that have guided international trade for centuries? I want to include, and since we have Transparency International here, let's start with the rule of law, even-handedness, aka most favored nation, right? Accountability, etc., non-discrimination, like product, etc. Are we going to abandon that, which I think, we can all agree has helped create legitimacy for the trading system as well as for regional trade agreements? I won't go on with the lecture, but those principles are totally undermined by what you're suggesting that we do.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. So I turn to you, and you have now 5 minutes to answer the question.
Oh, it's only one question for me?
It's one question for you, and then there is one question for the second.
Okay, no, because I don't have 5 minutes, maybe my colleagues can fill in. But what I'm saying is that, as a matter of fact, we're defending rule of law. We are defending all the values that you just mentioned there, because the kleptocrats, they are not respecting rule of law. They are twisting it or eroding it wherever they see it possible, and using their resources to harm our states and institutions in that regard. So by friendshoring, we're ensuring that those countries that are respectful for all of those fundamental values that we have as societies get the benefits of our trade. Now, in the case of the second category group countries that Ash mentioned, we should use that as an incentive that if you fulfill these values that we respect in category 1, or A, or whatever you want to call it, then you're free to come and join us in this group, to hope and aim for more countries to come along the democratic route. But then if it's a disincentive, then you're saying that it's an incentive for everyone to become kleptocratic regimes.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, a couple of responses to that. So the open economic order that was set up after GATT and the Bretton Woods system is something we would all like to preserve. It has led to, productivity gains and prosperity around the world. The question, however, is who should participate in that open economic order? Is it every nation, regardless of their own policies, or should there be some kind of parameters around creating that open economic order where the most unfettered access to that order and to markets in the system comes to those that play by certain rules? If you don't play by the rules, and by rules I mean not just economic rules, but rules on how you treat your own people, why should you, as a kleptocrat, as an autocrat, why should you have the benefit of gaining access to those markets and those trading streams if you're not willing to respect certain rules? So I think that's the importance of preserving the open economic order. It's layers of orders. It's not one or the other. And relatedly, the existing order remains in place while we friendshore. We're not abandoning WTO. We're not abandoning open market access based on existing agreements. We're layering on top of that another form of engagement and creating incentives if you want to participate. It's kind of like free trade agreements on top of the WTO system. If you want to get certain trade benefits, you commit to doing certain things. We're adding some additional criteria to those commitments. Who decides? Well, I think if any club that's created, the members of the club decide who qualifies. When the EU was established, the EU decides who becomes a member and whether they meet the criteria, or the OECD. So I don't see a problem with democracies in this club deciding who meets the criteria that they decide to set up.
Daniel, Lisandra, anything to add to those comments? Because we still have 1.5 minutes.
No.
Yeah, well,
All set?
You said it all.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way to go if you want to live freely. But if you don't want to live freely, you can vote for them at the end. Not living free means that you know what you're going to do for the rest of your life, so it has benefits.
Okay, those were the questions and comments for group number 1. You now, as an audience, have the opportunity to ask one question to group number 2. Yeah?
Hello?
yes.
Now it works. Okay, so one of the stronger arguments that I see in support of friendshoring, or actually the more extreme version, domestic shoring, was that in case of real disruptions of global supply chains, such as the pandemic or global conflict, you as a country do not want to be dependent on having your critical infrastructure outside of the country, especially an industrial base, which is one of the major concerns for the United States, which brings us back to the IRA and the CHIPS Act, right? Bring critical production back home. What do you say to people that want to do that, maybe even the entire 6%? How do you argue against that?
Start.
Sure. Okay.
Wonderful question. I would answer it with a couple of examples. So first, you have to accept the premise that if you decide to become autarkic and rely on yourself for what you need, that means if something happens to you, the rest of the world's not necessarily going to be there when you need it, right? And so I think my two favorite examples of where this came back to bite, even the United States, over the last couple of years, are vaccines and semiconductors. One of the vaccines that we authorized for use in the United States, so we had Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. The Johnson, it was an amazing feat, unbelievable that we had diversification, we had 3. It's good we had Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech because the Johnson & Johnson facility in the United States, even though it was authorized, worked great, production got completely screwed up. Making vaccines is really, really hard. They botched it, right? They contaminated samples. If that was the only one that had worked, we would not have had access to the vaccines in the United States. The Johnson & Johnson vaccines that we actually enjoyed and were vaccinated with in the United States came from Europe through international trade. The BioNTech vaccine obviously was invented in Germany, right? So if we'd been sole, domestic sourcing at that point, it would have been bad. Second, another shock, February of 2021, the United States had really strong Arctic winter storms that hit the state of Texas and shut down the power grid, where a good chunk of our domestic semiconductor facilities are located, right? The ones that make semiconductors for automobiles. If we had not been part of global supply chains and been able to import semiconductors from TSMC in Taiwan or Samsung in South Korea, the already big chip shortage would have been an even bigger problem. So I think that's my key argument there, is you do need to have diversification and not have home shoring, or however you want to call the worst of it.
Yeah, thank
Claudia,
you.
Melanie, do you want to come in?
Yes, I want to add, even though he already said everything, but we still have 3 minutes. So I think
And it's about making the argument again and again.
what Chad was rightly saying is, if you reshore or put the production back to your country, that doesn't make it safer. So as he said, one climate problem, we had the R disaster in Germany, and it's not safe. And what I said before in my comments, trade is a shock absorber, not a shock supplier, which means if you have a crisis like the financial crisis, like Corona crisis, trade helps. There's some minor things that didn't work in the beginning, but trade helps. Global value chains work, which means no reproduction, no nearshoring, but diversification. And that was the point we were making. Thank you.
And to add on that, there's other solutions. You can do more stockpiling, maybe have a critical supply of masks or tests or things like that, and diversify to have several sources. So if one fails, you have alternatives. So more diversification increases your resilience. And then there's one more thing I think that is important. It's not just about sourcing. We always, when we talk about friendshoring and dependencies, we always think about things we import that are important for our value chains. But in Germany, we all know we rely heavily on our exports. 1/4 of all jobs are dependent on German exports. And if we don't buy from other countries anymore, why would they buy our things? Why could we sell that to them? So I think that's the other thing that we also need to think about that is also critically important. We are a very open economy and rely on international trade on both sides.
You still have 1 minute left. All arguments made.
Maybe one more example, the baby formula case in the United States is one example of where when you produce yourself and then your source fails because there is a problem, then suddenly babies didn't have formula anymore, and that was because the country was so reliant on one source and did not have a diversified supply chain.
Okay, thank you to both teams. Now it is your turn again. We now have one question from the audience that goes to both teams. I see a hand. I don't have any preferences here, but I had 2 hands from this side, so I will take a hand now from this side. The gentleman here.
My question is a little bit one-sided, however.
But it should be a question for both teams.
So I can't change it so quickly. It's team 1, right?
We do.
Are you guys okay with, what's your position on sanctions against Russia and importing gas and other commodities? Are you okay with sending money to Putin to conduct genocide against Ukraine and other minorities inside Russia? Is that okay with you guys?
Yeah.
Okay, I have you answer first, and then I have team number 1 respond to the question?
You want to start?
No, you guys start.
Yes, we very much support sanctions against Russia. It's against, what they do is an aggression against another country. It's against the international law, and I think the only way to react in this case, in this specific case, is to decouple and to impose sanctions on Russia. But that does not go against my general argument that we need a deepening of global markets. But in this case, we should not trade with Russia and definitely decrease our dependency as soon as possible.
Imposing sanctions is always a political decision, and there are many, many good reasons for sanctions against Russia in this case. But when we need to decouple from a country like Russia, as in a situation as we see it now with the horrible aggression against Ukraine, it is even more important economically that we have many different alternatives to have energy supply, for example, or critical raw materials or other things. So the case of Russia actually is a very good example of why we do need diversified supply chains.
And I guess the only thing that I would add as a non-lawyer, but who plays one on a podcast periodically, is in the multilateral rules, we have this thing called Article 21. So we could use that as a defense for sanctions or whatever when we need to invoke them when certain countries out there do something really egregious like that.
Any other comment you want to make? Because you still have 2.5 minutes. No? Then I would turn to team number one.
It's a great question. Now, Russia wouldn't be in the position where it is today if we wouldn't have had the trade that we had with them for so long, and enable them to build up the technology, military hardware, and enable Putin to get the resources to get a grip on his country to the extent that he has done. So one way or another, it is not economical or morally right to wait until that kleptocratic rulership got to the stage where they start to invade and kill people around the world. We need to do something beforehand. If a country does not respect the democratic values that we live by, I don't think, I mean, to begin with, it's morally wrong for us to trade with them, but it's also not fair in a competitive sense, because the way that they can treat their labor force, the way that they can treat their people, the environment, is not going to our standard. Hence, we need to deal with countries that are like-minded, not for everything, but for some resources, and for divvying up the world in the appropriate categories. That's the way forward in order to prevent what is sadly happening in Ukraine.
Lisandra, Ash, do you want to add?
I agree on imposing sanctions against Russia. What we should not forget is that they are only effective if we have global cooperation, right? If we have other countries imposing sanctions against Russia. And so currently the challenge is how this is leading to trade diversion, and trade diversion towards other autocratic states that could increase power due to decoupling, let's say, from Western countries. So again, I'm totally in favor of imposing sanctions, but for them to be effective, a large number of countries need to impose the same sanctions. Otherwise, we risk also that we give more power to already powerful countries. Yeah.
So the question you raise also poses a scenario regarding Taiwan, which hasn't come up yet in this discussion. That is to say, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the US, Europe, was in a position where it could take steps to try to cut Russia off from the global economy without suffering too much pain from itself. Now, Europe obviously is going through energy ramifications, and those are serious. But nevertheless, there have been ways to deal with it. If China were to invade Taiwan tomorrow or next year, the economic ramifications of trying to sanction Beijing and sanction the Chinese economy would have huge counter ramifications for the US, Europe, and the global economy, because we're so interlinked and because our economies are so intertwined across the board, particularly including critical sectors where we're just critically dependent. So the time to start thinking about that is now, before they invade, not after they invade, before they take actions that we would deem to be inconsistent with the rules-based system, whether it's genocide against the Uyghurs. We're seeing that take place now. But if that kind of behavior continues and we want to have leverage to or we want to have freedom of action to respond, we need to start now by looking at friendshoring and ally shoring so that we de-link our economies, especially in those critical sectors, before something like that happens.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you also for your questions. We now have reached sort of the final round. I'm a campaign scholar, so I study campaigns quite a bit, and sort of the phase we are in right now with those teams is basically the get out the vote, right? You have to prepare now your rallies, your final rally speech. Each team has 6 minutes for their sort of final pulling together all the arguments and trying to convince the audience before we then turn to the audience again for your final vote to see whether your position after listening to the various arguments and to our debate has changed. So I would now like to start with team number 2, and you have, what do my notes say? You have 6 minutes, and you can choose whether you all want to speak or whether you sort of select a speaker from the team, but the next 6 minutes are yours.
I think we all want to speak, so...
I'll go first.
Okay.
Very quick. So I just want to, your thoughts, the question about sanctions raised 2 other points in my mind that are important to get out there and why interdependence is important. There is no ability to sanction rogue countries if you don't engage with them at all, aside from militarily, right? The reason why it's painful for Russia to get cut off from financial networks because it was initially integrated into financial networks. So you need to have some engagement on their side, interdependence with them, in order for you to impose costs on them to make them rethink their most egregious actions. And if you take that away, that's a concern, right? And so if we're talking about a likelihood of a Taiwanese invasion or a China invasion of Taiwan, partly what's holding China back is presumably the costs of what Western sanctions would mean for the Chinese economy as well, because of the current interdependence. If there were no interdependence, it would be free reign, right? There wouldn't be any cost to China of just sort of taking Taiwan today. So I think that it goes both ways. Interdependence can actually serve to identify to these potentially rogue countries what the costs of their egregious behavior and what they stand to lose from that as well.
So
Claudia.
we do believe in multilateralism and of the coexistence of different systems in the WTO. So we just need to make sure that this is traded on a fair basis. If we go to friendshoring, in my mind, that leads to block building, and that leads to an economic Cold War. We would have a fragmentation of the world economy. We just have the new World Economic Outlook by the IMF, which predicts, I think, through fragmentation, we would have minus of 7% global GDP, and this would be particularly devastating for the developing countries. We would have a global recession. We would no longer have the advantages of a global division of labor. We would have scarcely any innovation, because if you don't compete, if you just reshore or produce it on national level, you lack a lot of innovation capacities. And I do believe that you can't say, oh, on trade we do friendshoring, but on climate, why not work together? I think it swaps over to different policy areas, because we have this kind of new Cold War coming over. So I doubt that countries would be willing, that if we don't trade with them, but to give concessions in trade. And it's not about G7. We are not the countries with the high emissions. It's about India, it's about China, and it's about Brazil. And I'm not sure any of these countries would qualify for friendshoring. And then we have the gray area, the African countries. I mean, you can say, okay, rule of law, democracies, but there is countries in between, and they might be strategically important for us. So why take them out of our cooperation? Why not try to enhance the role that they play for us? Why not try to improve the situation that they have? If we just decouple from them because they do not share 100% of our values, that would be the bad thing. So I would definitely further put my point on deepening of global market and including more and more developing countries.
Melanie?
Well, as we said earlier, friendshoring is just a friendlier word for decoupling, and decoupling from a major part of the world. Claudia just mentioned a couple of examples. How would we even qualify friends? And I still haven't really heard a definition from the opposing team of who would qualify as a friend. Is it only the G7? Is it Western democracies? Is it democracies in general? But then let's look at countries who did not vote against Russia in the UN General Assembly, like India and others. So who qualifies there if we really want countries, our friends, to have exactly the same values as we do? Our group of friends and our trading partners becomes very, very, very small. And I would also mention the very positive effects that trade can have. It's about incentivizing change. And yes, of course, not everything changes to a better model just because we trade with countries, but still it is important, not just to convince countries to work with us on climate protection and many other important issues, but also to improve conditions in their own countries. Let me give you the example of Vietnam, for example. We have a trade agreement, the EU, with Vietnam, and because of that agreement, in the negotiations, they made it legal there to have trading unions in their country. So we can, with our negotiations, have sustainability chapters. We can have an impact on the conditions in those countries so that they actually match our values even more. But if we exclude them from the get-go because they do not match what we expect from them, then we're not going to improve anything. So also for those reasons, it is important to also work with partners that might not in every way already be like-minded. Thank you.
Okay. One last thing, since we have 40. This is a very unpopular thing to say, but there was a 4-year period where the country that I was from, many would not think was all that friendly, yes, or a friend. And so just defining a nice set of clean rules for who's friends and who's not over time is really tricky.
Okay, thank you very much. I now turn to team number 1 for their final round of arguments. Lisandra.
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that, governments can set incentives, but at the end, the sourcing decision is a decision of firms. Right? And so we have conducted a survey with firms asking how reliant they are on Chinese inputs and what they are planning in the future. And what we find interesting is that half of the firms that are highly reliant on Chinese inputs is actually planning to reduce imports from China. And 4 out of 5 of these firms plan to increase imports from other European countries. So this doesn't mean really a decoupling from China, but this means that firms are pricing in these geo-economic risks. Right? So they are willing to pay higher costs for these inputs to reduce risks in their supply chains. And so this is one argument of decreasing of how the geo-economic challenges have changed how firms also think about trade, because firms in general don't take these externalities into account in individual firms. And so, again, the more intensive cooperation with democracies can decrease risks, geo-economic risks, in particular when it comes to critical goods. And the current geo-economic challenges require an active trade policy with further democracies and further world regions to also increase the number of friends. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ash, Daniel, do you want to?
I'll say that, yes, democracy is on the extinction list. Fewer and fewer people in the world live in liberal democracies. And that's why we need to protect them. And this is an urgent cause. And thinking that open trade somehow will change the mindset of the kleptocracies and the way that they go about it is just incorrect. We cannot live in the 1970s think. And what we are doing thereby with open trade with autocracies or kleptocracies is opening ourselves up at great risk, putting profit over our values. The problems that the other team presents are all problems that we can work out. Who is going to be in which category? Which products, which resources should we look at? We're not being absolutionists here and saying that everything should be blocked and we should stop everything. We just say that we need to be clear in our mindset that a larger and growing part of the world is using corruption as a method of governance, and they're not running by the same rules and principles as us. And if we want to continue on living in a free society, we need to take steps, including in trade and in technology. Ash?
So you mentioned we don't want to have a 1970s think. We don't want to have a 1990s think either. At the end of the Cold War, there was a bet that we made, which was that by bringing Russia and China into an open global economy, it would lead to greater political liberalization and kind of more support for the rules-based system generally. Well, obviously, we've seen, given the behavior of Putin and Xi Jinping, that that's just not the case. Liberalization of trade, open, unfettered access to markets has only made them stronger while they continue to remain committed to their autocracies and their form of treatment of their own people. So we need a different approach. And now's the time to rethink where we're headed. There is a practical way to do it. We're not talking about decoupling. We're not talking about cutting off these countries entirely. We're talking about selecting industries and selecting ways about going about this in a practical way. If I could, we have a report that the Atlantic Council put out on ally shoring, which offers at least one idea. It's not the only one out there, but it's one approach to how to have a practical framework for ally shoring that allows us to protect our values and to protect our most important friends and allies. So the bottom line is that friendshoring is going to allow leading democracies to establish more resilient supply chains. It also counters trends towards protectionism, which the other side keeps bringing up, where we are running the risk of onshoring becoming the default. If we want to protect, if we want to ensure that chips are available freely or without issues, then make everything at home. Well, that's not practical. We need a wider circle of production, and usually, relying on friends and allies is the best way to proceed. We're in a strategic competition. We know that we're headed in this direction with China and Russia, and so friendshoring is going to give us the maximum advantage over the long term in terms of succeeding in this competition.
And as Ash plugged his report, I'll say that we have a session at the Munich Security Conference, 5 o'clock on Friday, on topics like this. And in closing, I say that as much as I would not prefer it to happen at all, an economic Cold War is a better outcome than a world war of a kinetic style. So,
okay, wow. Thank you very much. Okay. It's your applause. Thank you very much for putting, for laying out all the arguments, also for arguing perhaps for a line which you do not support. That's the whole exercise. And now we come to the final vote. You have here, or it should be here, the code or the QR code where you can cast your vote again, and let's see whether our debate, whether the exchange of arguments has actually changed your opinion.
Get out to vote, everyone.
Right.
Yeah.
I hope you can all see this.
Oh, there's.
Okay,
they have big screens on the sides as well. And thank you very much for the moderation.
It was a pleasure.
We didn't change anything.
Well, perhaps you did. We don't have the individuals. So perhaps the aggregate did change, but perhaps on an individual level it did. So.
Yeah, come on.
Oh,
come on. Are we allowed to vote?
Panelists are stubborn.
We are also going to see the percentage differences in a second. We are going to have a slide where we see if somebody improved or lost.
on you.
There we go.
See, we just needed to
Oh,
be a
see,
little
there
bit.
was a little bit here.
Wow, you won like
Wow.
0.4.
So friendshoring did, I mean, it did.
No,
make
it was all 6 of the voters that left. They were all our voters. So different sample sizes, not comparable.
Right?
They
Gained a
didn't.
few.
Yeah. They didn't see any hope.
That is really
There was, something happened. Something happened.
something did happen. No, the friendshoring team did win some over. So, And I have to say now I'm really proud of my team because everything works out technically and that they put this together. Great team effort, Espen team, you go.